What if the next global war isn't fought with missiles, but with currencies, resources, and silent political moves happening behind closed doors? While the world watches headlines, a deeper battle is unfolding. The US dollar under pressure, China securing rare earth resources, and countries like Brazil quietly becoming strategic players in a new global order. This isn't just politics, this is a financial war, and the outcome could reshape the value of your money, your investments, and the future of the global economy. The Great Financial Reset has already begun. Something unusual is happening in the global financial system, and most people don't even realize it yet. If you turn on the news, you'll hear about inflation, interest rates, geopolitical tensions, and rising national debt. But what you won't hear very often is that all of these events may actually be connected to something much bigger. Behind the headlines, the economic structure that has governed the world for nearly 80 years is slowly being reshaped, not overnight, not in a dramatic collapse, but through a series of quiet shifts that are changing how money moves, how power is distributed, and who ultimately controls the global economy. For Americans watching this, the real question isn't simply whether the system is changing, because it clearly is. The real question is whether the United States is losing its position at the center of that system, or whether it is quietly preparing to dominate the next version of it. To understand why this moment matters, we have to go back to the end of the Second World War, when the modern financial order was created through the Bretton Woods Agreement. At that time, the United States emerged as the strongest economy on Earth, holding the majority of the world's gold reserves and possessing an industrial capacity that had no equal. The agreement effectively placed the US dollar at the heart of the global financial system, allowing countries to trade with each other using a currency backed by American economic strength. Over time, this arrangement evolved into something even more powerful. The dollar became the world's primary reserve currency. International trade flowed through American financial institutions, and the global banking system became deeply connected to infrastructure that the United States could influence or control. For decades, this system created stability and growth, and it allowed the U.S. to finance enormous levels of spending while maintaining a unique position in global finance. But systems built on trust can begin to fracture when that trust is questioned. And one of the moments that triggered a serious global conversation happened in 2022 during the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In response to the conflict, Western governments froze hundreds of billions of dollars belonging to Russia that were held in foreign reserves. For many observers, this was simply a geopolitical sanction, but for leaders and central bankers around the world, it sent a powerful signal. It demonstrated that access to the international financial system could be restricted or removed under certain circumstances. For countries that had spent decades storing wealth in dollar-denominated assets, that realization raised an uncomfortable question. If a major nation could suddenly lose access to its reserves, what did that mean for everyone else participating in the same system? Almost immediately, subtle shifts began to appear in the behavior of central banks and governments. Countries that had traditionally accumulated large reserves of U.S. Treasury bonds began slowly diversifying their holdings. Many started purchasing gold at levels not seen in decades, partly because gold exists outside the digital financial networks that can be influenced by governments or sanctions. At the same time, alternative economic alliances and payment systems began receiving more attention, including discussions among nations within the group known as BRICS about increasing trade settlements in their own currencies rather than relying entirely on the dollar. None of these changes instantly dismantle the current system, but they represent the early stages of a long-term shift in how global trade might operate in the future. Despite these developments, the United States still holds enormous structural advantages that are often overlooked in discussions about a financial reset. Much of the world's banking infrastructure remains connected to networks like SWIFT, which continues to facilitate the majority of international financial transactions. American capital markets remain the deepest and most liquid in the world, attracting investors from nearly every country seeking stability and scale. The U.S. also maintains an unmatched ecosystem of technological innovation, with companies such as Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and NVIDIA driving advances in artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and semiconductor design. These industries are not just economic sectors, they represent the digital infrastructure that will power the next phase of global productivity and economic growth. At the same time, however, the United States faces a challenge that cannot be ignored. The country's national debt has climbed to extraordinary levels, surpassing tens of trillions of dollars, and the cost of servicing that debt continues to rise as interest rates increase. Historically, nations dealing with large debt burdens have relied on economic growth, financial innovation, or inflation to gradually reduce the relative weight of that debt. In many ways, the current technological revolution centered on artificial intelligence and digital infrastructure may provide exactly the kind of productivity expansion that could help sustain American economic dominance. Massive investments in data centers, energy infrastructure, and advanced chips are already reshaping the global economy, and the companies leading these developments are overwhelmingly based in the United States. Yet this technological transformation has another consequence that receives far less attention. The digital economy, despite its virtual appearance, relies heavily on physical resources. Artificial intelligence systems require enormous data centers that consume vast quantities of electricity and depend on metals like copper, lithium, and rare earth elements. The supply chains for these materials stretch across multiple continents and often intersect with geopolitical competition. One of the most significant players in these supply chains is China, which has spent decades building dominance in the processing and refining of many strategic minerals. This creates a new kind of economic rivalry in which control over resources and technology becomes just as important as traditional financial power. As this transformation unfolds, resource-rich nations may become increasingly influential in the global economic landscape. Countries capable of supplying food, energy, and raw materials could find themselves in a stronger negotiating position than in previous decades. Among these nations is Brazil, which possesses vast agricultural output, significant mineral reserves, and growing energy production. In a world where industrial expansion and digital infrastructure demand ever greater quantities of physical inputs, these kinds of resources become strategically valuable. All of these developments suggest that what we are witnessing may not simply be a normal economic cycle, but the early stages of a broader restructuring of the global financial system. Moments like this have appeared several times throughout modern history, often following major geopolitical shifts or technological revolutions. Each time the global order adjusts, capital flows in new directions, industries rise and fall, and countries reposition themselves within the hierarchy of economic power. The process can unfold gradually, sometimes over decades, but the effects eventually reshape the entire landscape of global finance. For viewers in the United States, the most important takeaway may be that the story of the so-called financial reset is not necessarily about the collapse of American influence. It may instead be about the transition from one economic era to another, where technological leadership, financial infrastructure, and geopolitical alliances determine who shapes the rules of the next system. The dollar still plays a central role in global finance. American companies still dominate many of the most important technologies, and U.S. capital markets continue to attract global investment. Whether those advantages will be enough to maintain leadership in a rapidly changing world remains one of the most important economic questions of our time. And that is why understanding these shifts matters, because when the global financial system changes, it rarely happens in a single dramatic moment. It happens quietly, through policy decisions, technological breakthroughs, and strategic competition between nations. By the time the transformation becomes obvious to everyone, the biggest opportunities and the largest transfers of wealth have often already taken place. The real challenge is recognizing the change while it is still unfolding.